everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw wet fur in pastels. Now the first thing that I like to do is really break this up and simplify the process, because wet fur can look very overwhelming and confusing. It can make the fur group together, and I really do like to focus just on the shapes that I see. So here I'm using a oval shaped soft tool, and I'm using pan pastels to apply my main light and dark pigment. Now I'm only focusing on my lights and my darks because that helps for me to isolate the main shapes of that fur that I can see. Now it really does help to simplify the process if we're not actually focusing on this as drawing fur. If we just look at the lights and the darks first, it becomes far less overwhelming. Now it doesn't matter the texture of the fur or the colour of the fur, no matter what that wet fur looks like, the techniques that I show here would work regardless. So here, that first layer, as I say, I'm just using my pan pastels to map in those main lights and darks. Now the key at this stage is not to fill the tooth of the paper. This is something that I talk thoroughly about in all of my step-by-step tutorials on Patreon. Filling the tooth of the paper is going to significantly limit the amount of layers, if any, that can be applied with our pencils. Now if you start working with your pencils and you feel that they're just gliding over the surface like the pigment's not able to stick, then that's a real good indication that the tooth of the paper has been filled. Now you could use a workable fixative, or unfortunately you may have to start again if that happens, so it's just best to use the right techniques, the right amount of pastel at each layer to prevent that happening at all. Now for my second layer, this is where I'm going to start to work with my pencils, and again I'm just looking to refine my lights and my darks and get more of the shape of that fur. Now the one thing that I do speak about in the real-time step-by-step version of this on my Patreon is how to break it up into really small sections. Now normally when I work on studies like this, I will do all of my base layer for that study, which I've shown now. But if I was working on the entire dog, I would definitely break this up into smaller chunks just to make sure that we don't rush through crucial layers. Now by working on these small sections here, I've got 5 or 6 clumps of wet fur. That's all I'm focusing on. I'm now starting to get the shapes of that more accurate, and as I say, the contrast, the lights and the darks is becoming more defined. Now as I continue to layer, I'm going to gradually build up what details I add. Now the biggest tip at this stage is don't add your brightest highlights too soon. You want to save those for those later layers. We need to be focusing on what's closest to the skin first and building up from there. Now I have a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll pop that in the description below if it's of interest. But there I talk about 3 main things: fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. Now there are a few factors that are going to be considered when thinking of the pencil technique, such as how much pressure to apply, how to move the pencil, even where on the barrel of the pencil to hold that. Even that makes a big difference. You'll never see me hold a pencil and create details by holding it right close to the lead. That's going to force excessive pressure on that pencil and force those details to look more thick, potentially clumpy, and therefore it's not going to have that refined look that we're going for. So the way that we use that pencil is crucial. And as I say, this is something that I focus thoroughly in all of my tutorials on Patreon. Now the direction of my pencil strokes, and therefore the direction of the fur, is very important for building up that 3-dimensional shape of the animal. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So even though this fur is wet and clumped together, you can still see that it looks like it starts to curve away on both left and right hand sides, and that's going to help to build up the shape of the body. We of course have the shoulder blades and very important structures under the fur that's helped to be determined by the placement of that through the fur direction. Now the length of the fur is going to be determined by how long that pencil is in contact with the paper. So of course if you've got a shorter coated animal, then that pencil may only need to be in contact with that paper for a split second. This coat is almost like a mid-length, so I needed to be making sure that my pencil was creating the right stroke for the texture that I'm trying to replicate. Now when you're working on dry fur, the pencil technique is going to be slightly different, and the layering process, although you're going to be building up the layers in the same way I am here, you're going to have more fluffier, looser details to include. So it's really important to make sure to study that reference photo. Now when I'm grouping my details together here, I'm also thinking about the thickness of those pencil strokes. So this is determined by a couple of factors. One, how much pressure we're applying to the pencil. Secondly, how sharp or how blunt that pencil tip is, and again, how we're moving that pencil. Those three things can really affect the look of that pencil stroke. So it's all about a combination of how those pencil techniques come together depending on the fur texture that we're trying to replicate. Now here, as I've continued to layer, I am still focusing on refining more of that detail, but I still haven't come in with my lightest pencils. I'm going to save those for those later layers. Now, the one thing that I think is really important when drawing wet fur is to remember that it's all about a layering process, and initially it probably won't look great until we get to more of those mid layers. It's now here where I'm starting to build up more of that depth that I felt more comfortable with the piece. Now, that's not to say that anything's wrong, it's just that those earlier layers, they're not going to look great until more of that contrast is established. There are a couple of things that are going to really help make that fur wet. So how the fur is clumped together here, that is obviously a real distinctive feature of wet fur. But the second is the contrast. Now, in order to make anything look wet or shiny, so even the metal on a dog's tag, all of that, water, no matter what it is, it's all about high contrast. So you want to have your shadows nice and dark and your highlights nice and bright. That's what's going to make it look like it's shiny, like it's reflecting more of that light. So here, as I'm continuing to layer, I'm starting to then darken up some of my shadows in between the clumps of wet fur, and then at my later layers I'm going to come in with some of my light up pencils. Now, I know this is something that I've already mentioned, but it is so important to make sure to focus on good contrast. Now, one of the questions that I'm asked frequently is, how do we know which colours to select when working with colour-based mediums? Now, this is something that I do cover thoroughly in my Patreon tutorials. I show you a very simple colour wheel system method so that you can really simplify that process from all of the pencils that you have in front of you to really know which pencils to select for that reference photo. But really, it's the values of that colour that's more important. So if you can see a brown in a reference photo, it's so crucial to make sure that you're choosing the right shade. So whether or not it's the light or darker version of that brown, rather than worrying about the exact coloured pencil. So that there is something to pay very close attention to, and it will make it easier for simplifying which pencils to choose from the many that we do have in front of us. You know, if you've got a few different shades of grey like what I'm using here on the lighter fur, as long as you make sure that it's as light or as dark as it should be for that area, that one layer that you're working on, then it's still going to look realistic. You could have 2 or 3 pencils that would give you the same outcome, as long as the value of that pencil is similar. So I want to be making sure that I'm really capturing that contrast and the use of values throughout. Now, of course, colour is important. I don't want to make it out that it's not, but it isn't, I feel, as important as the values. And the colour aspect of it is something that I do focus thoroughly in the step-by-step versions. I can really talk you through that because I record my tutorials with a voiceover while I'm drawing. Everything's explained in the moment, and I do mention why I'm choosing that colour, but I also mention other pencils that you could use instead, because as I've said, there are so many different ways to get to the same end. Now, I speak a lot about the importance of using the right technique and layering process, but those things can only be allowed if the paper is able to cope with those techniques. Now, I like to use Pastelmat paper because it really does grip the pastel in a very unique way, and it enables us to build up those layers gradually, and we've got plenty of tooth of that paper to work with. Now, the more tooth of the paper, but not having too much of a textured paper, enables us to build up those layers but also get those nice fine details. Now, a question that I'm often asked on social media is, how do we stop getting that grainy look to some of the pencil strokes when working with pastels? Now, this is a great question, and it really does depend on the techniques and how the pastel's been applied. But one of the most crucial things that can really affect that is how much pastel is applied at each stage. Now, of course, this is going to really vary. Pan pastels, as I've mentioned earlier, we do have a tendency to potentially want to use more pastel than we should, and that could end up filling too much of that tooth early on. But as we layer here, we're really gradually filling the tooth of the paper, and that's the key aspect. It's gradually filling that tooth, so each layer of detail that we add should gradually start to become looking more smoother and finer, because that pastel and the tooth of that paper is becoming slightly flatter. However, one thing I can't stress enough is that even when a portrait is finished, if you're working with the techniques that I'm showing here, you should still have plenty of tooth of the paper left to continue to add more layers if you felt you needed to. So Pastelmat is a wonderful paper and it really does allow for the best techniques. Now because of that, it does really enable any artists who are new to the medium to maximise the use of those pastels. You know that you're working on a paper that allows for all of the best techniques, so therefore it's a great paper to practice on and it is worth investing in. However, I do have 2 tutorials here on YouTube. I've got the real-time versions on Patreon where I'm using a different paper. It's much smoother, but I was very surprised with how many layers it did allow. So I'll link those 2 tutorials in the description below if that's of interest, and the paper is significantly cheaper. But the one thing that I want to mention about that is, although it's cheaper and it still allows for me to create a photorealistic drawing, it's not going to allow for the same number of layers of Pastelmat. So if you're looking to take your art to the next level, or you really are looking to practice the medium and use the very best of all techniques to maximise the use of that medium, then Pastelmat is by far the best choice. So at this stage here, I'm at a really nice point where I can start to now refine more of the detailing and take this to the next level. Now quite often artwork is called finished too soon, so you look at this here and you think, okay, it looks like wet fur, it's okay to leave it like that. But now when I start to come in with my highlights and I'm really reinforcing my contrast, look how much of a difference it's making. This has that more of a three-dimensional, that more of the depth, the deeper look to that fur, and it's all because I'm adjusting and refining my contrast. The use of adding these highlights here, saving those highlights for the last layers, makes a massive difference no matter what fur texture or subject we're drawing. And at this stage as well, this is where we want to be adding those finer, wispier hairs that are sitting on the very top. This is at the stage where you would also be drawing the whiskers if you were drawing the entire animal. Any hairs that are overlapping everything else are best to be left until those last layers, otherwise we do have to end up drawing around them with that layering process, and obviously that's far harder and more time consuming. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, I'd be very grateful. It makes a huge difference to my channel. And I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to this or any of my other real-time step-by-step tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. If you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.